Backup and recovery. In this nugget, we'll be taking a look at backup and recovery. We'll take a look at the backup utility that is included with Windows. It's actually pretty good. What it does is it takes a system image or kind of a snapshot of the entire hard drive if you want. And you can also use a data backup so you can catch user files in your backup. There's a few backup gotchas that I have to make sure that you're aware of because there's certain things that you could do to shoot yourself in the foot with this stuff. And then there's also some system image restore topics that we need to discuss. This is going to allow you to restore the system to a known good state. We also take a look at system protection. This is going to be where rather than doing something like a system restore where you restore the entire hard drive, you're going to be using snapshots of the data that are called restore points that also take you back in time. And then there's also this other recovery item. That's just kind of some miscellaneous items where we'll discuss things such as the last known good and driver rollback and startup repair. Have you ever been in an emergency situation without a backup plan? I know I certainly have. You see, a few years back, I was in Glacier National Park, and it was after the season, so it was an early winter, and there was a deep snowfall a couple of days before I had arrived. Well, I was on the east side of Glacier, which is my favorite side, but I wanted to go to the west side to check some things out. But the road that goes through Glacier National Park was closed because of the snow. So I had to go all the way down Highway 89 here, and then kind of make this awkward right turn over here, and then go back this direction on Highway 2 to get to the west side. Well, as I was going down Highway 89, I realized, hey, there's actually a shortcut I can take here. And you can see here that 49 cuts off a few miles as opposed to going through this kind of wedge shape right here. So I got to 49 and I looked at it, and apparently they had closed it down. They put barriers up there because of the snow and closed the highway, and I was quite disappointed. Well, as I was sitting there pondering my unfortunate situation, a big white four-wheel drive pickup truck with the knobby tires, and it was full of cowboys, actually blew right past me. Yes, and I mean that, cowboys with the hats on and everything. They went up this road, and I said, hey, if they can do it in their big four-wheel drive, I can do it in my four-wheel drive Explorer. Well, I started to go up this road, and it was very rutted, and it was very dangerous. In fact, since it had snowed a couple of days earlier, there was some sunshine, and it had melted a little bit of the snow, creating an icy covered road underneath the snow. And I was sliding all over. It's very high up in the altitude there. It's on the side of a mountain, and there's no guardrails. I was scared to death. I've never been more scared than I was on that day. I thought surely I would tumble down the side of that mountain to my certain death. Well, as I finally got past the danger zone right around in this area here, I decided to pull off the road, and it was fairly safe by the time I got around here. And this is where I decided to take this photograph, kind of commemorating my experience and being glad to be alive. And that's this photograph right here. And although it doesn't look quite so treacherous from this perspective, back when I was up in these mountains and trying not to slide off and fall to my certain death, it was quite a lot more scary. But anyway, sometimes we have a bad situation occur, and there's no way to back up. When I was on that mountain, there was no way for me to make a three-point turn or something like that and back up because of the snow and the ice. I was already practically sliding off the road. So when it comes to a backup solution in our data, however, what kind of things does Windows offer us? Well, I've got to tell you, they've got some really good solutions. One of those things is you can do is to create what we call a system image. What this will do is it'll create a backup of any volumes with operating system files on it. Now, in a typical installation, that's going to include your system reserved partition, which is that first 100 megabytes and sometimes 200 megabytes hidden partition that's at the front of the drive. That's usually 100 megabytes, like I said. And then the other one would be your C drive in most cases, unless you change the drive letter for your operating system files. And I'm going to demonstrate probably most of this stuff here in a little while. But what I want to point out here as well is that on the C drive that you're backing up, what if you have all your user files there? You know, your documents and your videos and your pictures and your music and everything like that. Well, then what happens if you want to restore maybe just one song that you deleted and you meant to keep? Now what? Well, if it's not in the recycle bin, you cannot restore it from your system image directly. In order to get it back, you would have to actually restore the entire system image, which is basically a picture of the full hard drive. So it would be a complete restore when you do this, and you would then also lose any additional files you had created since you had made the backup. So that could be quite disruptive. Now, there's a workaround for that, which is not part of the exam, but I think you might be interested in it. If you take your backup, for example, if it's on an external USB drive or something like this, plug it into a Windows Server 2008 server, you can use Windows Server 2008's backup and restore utility to find the file in the backup and then restore it on that server. And then you could just copy and paste it to your Windows 7 machine again. So that's really the only way to recover files from a system image backup made on Windows 7, although you may also be able to use the WBadmin utility. But it's a little bit convoluted in some of the options and switches you would have to use with that. It's a lot of typing. I just find it easier to use the server. Again, not part of the exam, but it might be handy if you need to know it. Now, there's also another option there. You could back up also, the data. Now, if I back up the data plus the system image, even if my data is on drive C, then what it'll do is it'll include an additional backup that's compressed into zip files. And it also uses a catalog, and using that method, I can then recover individual files, whereas if I use only a system image, then I'm stuck with the entire system image that I would otherwise have to restore. So this would allow me to recover individual files and folders. When you back up the data, you cannot back up only specific files. You have to select entire folders. Okay, so there's no way to do only individual files like you can do with some older backup utilities from Windows like NT Backup or with third-party products. So you could choose to create a backup of the data and the system image combined. You can do both of those, and you can schedule them. Now, contrary to some Microsoft documentation that they have for the 70-680 exam, a book that's been written about it from Microsoft, which I might add is an excellent book from what I've seen of it, they do have an error in that because they say that you cannot schedule a system image. Well, you can. That's part of the whole point of it. And that's different than Windows Vista, where you were not able to do that previously. Now, your backup targets, where it actually stores the backup, could be an internal or external hard drive, and that would be like something connected by a FireWire, USB, eSATA, something like that for these external ones. You can also back it up to a CD and or DVD, although you'd probably have to have multiple CDs or DVDs, and it'll just prompt you every time you need to supply a new blank one. You could back up to a USB flash drive, but that would be for data only. It will not accept a system image. Even if you have one of those ginormous 64 gigabyte USB flash drives, it still will not take. Also, you could back it up to a VHD, and what you would do with this, and we worked with VHDs early in this series, but what you would do with this is you could create a VHD that's on empty space on some other hard drive that you have. You should not create it on the same drive that you're backing up, but create it on some other drive, and then you can mount it in disk management, and then assign a drive letter to it after you've formatted it. Well, then you could create a backup to that VHD. Now, I don't really see a lot of cause for that. I'd rather just use normal drives, but it is possible at least, and you probably should know about it if nothing else. There's also network destinations, but one thing I have to tell you about that is that if you back up a system image to a network destination, because of the volume shadow copy service that's in use there, it's really only going to be able to read local data. So when you back up to a network destination, it'll only keep a single copy. And if you were to make another backup at a later point in time using a system image to that network backup destination again, it would just overwrite the first copy. Okay? Whereas on local backup targets, like internal or external hard drives, for example, it will keep multiple versions of your system image. And this kind of takes us to some other backup gotchas and tips. This is what I just mentioned. A network destination will only store a single image copy. Other backups that you make to that same location for images will be overwritten. And then the local storage, this is something that, again, that I'm afraid Microsoft is wrong on this. For local storage like external serial ATA drives, which is what I use because they're the fastest type, well, you can keep multiple versions on those. On the Microsoft book for the 70-680, there's a couple of authors that wrote a book there for Microsoft Press. They are excellent authors. It is actually a very good book, but they're flatly wrong on this topic because they say the same thing happens on the local storage as does on network destinations, and they think that it will keep overriding whatever you have stored locally. That's just flatly not true. You can keep multiple versions locally. Also, EFS files are not going to get backed up, so just be aware of that. You may need to come up with some other solution for this. There's a file there on the backup media called mediaid.bin. This is a critical file. If that file becomes deleted or corrupt, you cannot restore your data using conventional means, and you'll have to come up with some workarounds to get that data back. And one of the workarounds you could work with, if you did have problems with your backup, the mediaid.bin was corrupt, is that as long as the VHD files themselves, which comprise this system image, are still intact, then you can mount those. And by the way, you can also then copy files out of there. So it's another method for being able to retrieve individual files, because you can mount those, remember, in disk management. So you mount those VHDs, and then what you could do is to get individual data files out of them. Or if you still want to do a complete system image restore, then what you'll have to do is other methods. For example, you could use Acronis True Image. This is what I did recently, in fact, because the very machine that I'm recording on right now had serious corruption on 2 hard drives, and it totally brought down my entire system, even though it was RAID 10 array. Well, my backup had been corrupt because it was missing, or this file was missing or corrupt. So what I did was I just used Acronis True Image Home, which the current version is the 2010 edition, and then it has a utility there that you can convert your VHD files, which were still fine, and I converted those to the native Acronis backup file format, which is a TIB file. Then I restored those to the drive, ran WinRE, did a startup repair, and the system started up just fine, and I'm recording on that very machine right now. It was quite lengthy, I do have to say that, because it takes time to convert those files and then to restore them, and they were, quite a big files as well. Another thing to be aware of is that if you have any network locations in your library, like I do, for example, then and I mean this thing, where you can go to the properties of your documents or the properties of your pictures and all this kind of stuff and go to properties here. If it points to a network location like what I've got here, it'll have a problem with that, and it's not going to be able to properly back it up, and the backup will not complete. The error message actually says that it was not able to find that drive letter or that network resource, and I don't really understand why, because it should be able to, but it just doesn't. Alright, enough of the whiteboard. Let's go ahead and take a look at actually making a backup. Now you can get to this through Control Panel, System and Security, and then Backup and Restore, but I usually just click on Start and then type Backup, and it pops right up. You can do this, you can create a system image, and then when doing this, you just browse, it'll look for a hard drive that's capable of storing a system image, and normally it's going to be the largest drive that it can find will be the one that pops up here, the one with the most free space. That happens to be the correct assumption in my case, and then I would just be able to click on Next, Next, and Finish. Notice you could again do DVDs, which would burn those, but you have to swap them out, and also a network location, but again, that's just for one-off backups. Now, this would not be a scheduled backup. It, again, would be just a one-off backup that I could then use at some other point in time. And sometimes I'll do this if I've got expensive software that I've just installed that has a activation code of some kind or something like that. And I'll just, as soon as I get that activation code entered in and it's properly done, then I immediately make a system image backup, because I'm saying, with my luck, this whole thing will blow up right after I burn my license. And then I'll have to call and beg for forgiveness for another license or something. So the other thing you could do, though, this is probably a good solution if you have a system that's regularly connected to its backup source, like an external hard drive, or if you have an internal hard drive that's always available. You could set up backup, and this would include not only your system image, potentially, but also all of your data files. Now, with this method, I'm pointing to my backup, and you can see it there. Again, you have a network option, but it's only for one-offs. And then I could let Windows choose, which would choose all of my data in the common location that you can see right here, a part of my profile, for example, and a system image. But I can also choose Let Me Choose, and I'm going to do that one because it'll show you what Windows would have chosen anyway, which would be the system image plus all of our data. And I could also then choose, like the C drive here with a check mark, but it doesn't really make much sense because I'm already selecting all that with the system image. The only additional advantage I would have with that is it would allow me to pick out individual folders here for individual restore outside of restoring an entire image that are not included in this location. So, for example, this financials folder, where we had our executive compensation that we saw in a previous nugget, for example, that's not really included in any of this because it's outside of the profile settings. So I could include that here if I wanted in addition to the rest of this. Now, if you take a look at the rest of this, you can see here that the trainer's libraries, the documents library, and so forth will also be included. And one thing to identify here is that notice it doesn't allow you to select individual files. You have to do it a folder at a time. That's the most granular you can get, is an individual folder at once. And again, it warns you that EFS is not included in these settings. Now also, by default, it's going to create a backup every Sunday at 7 o'clock p.m. You can change that schedule so that you can back up, daily if you want to. On one of my systems, I have it back up daily every morning, early in the morning at I think it's 4:30 or something like that. And then you can specify what time you want it to back up and the like. I'm just going to go back to our default here, though, and we'll go ahead and save the settings, run the backup. This is going to take a little bit of time, but once it's complete, we'll then see that we have the ability to do either a bare metal restore, also known as a complete PC restore, or we could, which was where you restore the entire thing to even new hardware, or restore the whole hard drive categorically. Or you could just do individual files. Now, although you can only back up at a folder level, you can restore at a file level if you want to. And if you want to look at a progress report for what's currently going on with a backup, this will identify what's taking place here for you. And then while I'm waiting for that backup to take place, let's also talk about how we could restore a system image. What you'll do with this, and again, this is also known as a bare metal restore or a complete PC restore, is that you'll boot using WinRE. Now, this is a special recovery environment that will be made available to you at the end of your first system image backup, and you'll get a prompt that asks if you want to create this WinRE disk. And I think I've got one actually in my own machine right now, so let me take a look at it. Sure enough, I do. Okay, it's over here. You can see it's this DVD, it's the repaired disk, and that's how it's going to be identified. And you can see that it's just got some a boot manager here and so forth. This is basically the same kind of a boot environment that you get with WinPE. It's just that this one goes right to repair options, and it doesn't offer to install Windows for you. Now, if you don't have this WinRE disk, and I don't actually normally create them, I just happen to have created that one we just looked at, you can also choose an advanced recovery option, which also appears in Control Panel, and in the interface you can tell it that you want to restore a system image. And then it'll ask you to reboot, and when it does so, it'll automatically place WinRE and make it available for you, so it should boot right to WinRE. Barring that, however, you can still use the system repair disk that I just mentioned and that I just showed you, or you can boot the Windows operating system CD, or actually DVD, I guess it is. And within that, instead of choosing to install Windows, there's an option there to choose Repair. From there, you can then select the option to restore a Windows image. And then when you restore, you could select your previous image, this is the one that was most recently made, and that's the one it usually offers to you. Or you could select a couple of other things. Number one, you could select additional backups. There will be additional image backups available to you, and they'll appear in the interface if indeed there's been more than one made. Or you could select a different location. So, for example, maybe the computer that you're trying to do a bare metal restore on never actually had any backups made on it. And especially if the drives are empty at the current time, then you'll have to choose to select a different location and then browse to the drive that actually has the backups on it. It'll read the media ID data as well as certain catalog data, and then it allows you to select which backup you want to restore. And then you may also need certain drivers. If you can't access the drive where the backup is, it's not really as much of an issue as it used to be. But if it's USB, very likely you'll be able to access it. If it's FireWire, very likely. If it's eSATA, you may have it attached to a controller that's not included in the default set of Windows drivers. So you may have to have a set of drivers available on floppy disk, flash drive, or CD, and then point to those drivers, and then it will be able to load the appropriate drive once the drivers are also loaded. Also, this only includes data if the data was on an operating system drive, because remember, a system image is pretty much just a snapshot of the entire operating system. And if your actual user data was on drive D, but that wasn't part of the operating system information, then that would never have gotten backed up in a conventional system image. Therefore, your data is not part of the restore. However, if you stored your files and your data in the actual C drive, for example, which is, and it's in part of your profile that was part of the image backup, then it will be restored. Alright, and then the backup, now we can see here, has been complete. It gives you a nice little summary here of when everything took place. And then you can also restore all users' files or just your own files. There's a little button over there for just your files if you want. You can browse for files or folders if there's something specific that you want to restore. And you can see here, actually, let me go back to this. I'll go to this annual summary, for example, and I can add that one in here and then click next. And then you can also choose the original location or an alternate location. This is what we call a dummy restore, where you want to make sure that you still have the original file rather than overwriting it. Whereas if I want to overwrite the original file, I can do this, or if it's gone, of course, then it'll just go back to its original location as well. And then you'll see a prompt here asking if you want to copy and replace it. Really, they're both the same file because I haven't changed anything, but I'll just choose copy and replace. Not much to it, and then that's pretty much it. Alright, and then here what I'm doing is I'm just in VMware rebooting that machine, but I'm booting from the Windows repair disk, or the WinRE repair disk. And then we'll see a prompt here to select a keyboard, self-explanatory item there. And as we click on next, we'll see that it does identify in the background here a specific operating system installation. Now, this is not what we're talking about quite yet. This is another tool that we'll talk about a little bit later on, but you can use a system recovery option here where it will just do a system protection restore. We're not going to do that for our current purposes. We want to restore the entire computer using the system image that we created earlier. Then we just click on next. And it'll, of course, scan our backup file. Now, our backup disk. Now, here it is. This is the last backup that we had. If that's not the one that I actually want, then I can choose Select a System Image and click Next, and then it would list all the other ones that might be available down through here for us as well. Then you just click on Next and identify which backup, again, that you're interested in from that drive. Then click Next, and then you can also choose to format and repartition disks. And then if you need to install additional drivers, for example, for devices that might not be recognized during the restore process and that Windows doesn't have drivers for, you can add those in. And then you can also choose Advanced here to automatically restart the computer and check update disk error information. I'm going to clear that one off so that we can see the result when we're finished. Also, you could choose to exclude disks if there were multiple other disks here that you did not want to get formatted. Then as you click on Next and Finish, that's pretty much going to be it. This just tells me it's going to wipe everything out and restore it with the image. And then after a certain point, it'll offer if you want to restart your computer. I'll go ahead and say Restart Now. And what we'll see happen here is when it comes back up, it's just going to be exactly the same kind of operating system that it was at the time this system image was created. And then after the system image has been applied, here I've logged in, and you can see that it's exactly the same operating system. Everything is exactly configured the same way. That I don't have the any graphical wallpaper. I just got this blue-colored wallpaper. I should have some documents here. Let me see where I put those. On drive C, there's our financials. There's our annual summary. Remember, we looked at that, I think, in our last nugget. So I've still got all of my data, and everything is exactly restored the same way it was at the time the system image was made. Let's also address system protection. I apologize for this crowded whiteboard, but I didn't want to spill it over into a second one, so I guess I got a little too conservative. But anyway, the idea here is that we want to have something called system restore points. These are available on NTFS volumes, and they're kind of a snapshot in time of the current settings of the registry, various system information, and shadow copies. Now, shadow copies, I'll show you those here in just a moment, but the basic idea with these is that they will give you point-in-time snapshots of your user data. So that if you don't like the way a document appears right now, maybe you saved some changes to it and they were the wrong changes, or you messed something up, well, you can go back to a previous point in time as long as there was a system restore point made, and that might be more suitable for you to go back to a previous version of that. I'll show you about that here in a little while. You can also just recover the system in general. So for example, if you've had a settings change, which is generally what system restore points are good for, that might be useful. Maybe you updated a driver, or maybe you had an application install, and one or both of those things caused the system to start blue screening you or not perform reliably, or some other kind of a nagging problem. Well, you can go back to one of these system restore points that were created prior to the installation of that driver or application. And if you need to go back to a previous point in time for a system restore point, it doesn't actually restore the data. I know I talked about user data here in shadow copies. That's still relevant, but if you do have an issue and you restore back to a previous point in time using a restore point, there will be no user data files affected by this. So if you want to go back to a previous point in time, you'll have to use something else called previous versions. And I'll, again, show you that here shortly. Also, as I may have said, these are going to be created once a week, the system restore points, and also before system changes such as a driver and application, and also before a restore from within Windows. So, if I don't like the way Windows is running right now, and I run a system restore to go back to a previous point in time, before it even does that, it creates a restore point of my current condition, and then it will restore to the previous point in time. And the reason why it does that is if I go back to the previous point in time and realize that it doesn't fix the issue, then I can just revert that change. Also, when it comes to configuring system protection, I'm going to show you how to do that, and then we'll show you about the shadow copies here, and we'll take a look at how that works. So how do we go about working with restore points? Well, you'll need to go to the system properties, so I'm right-clicking on the computer, choosing Properties, and then you'll go to this item right here, System Protection. Now, there may be other ways to get here, but this is probably the most obvious way, and it's not easily discovered through other locations in Control Panel. So this is how I would recommend it. And then what you can do with this is if you have previous restore points, maybe one that was made yesterday, and that's the one I want to go back to, well, I can click System Restore, and that'll show me previous restore points that I can then go back to. For example, in this case, I've only got this one that I made manually just a little while ago, and I just called it Restore Point 1. The other thing I could do is I could configure the ability of this to use restore points at all. So I would go down here to Configure, and I would say Restore System Settings, and that would include things like I said, the system information, the registry settings, things like that, and previous versions of files, meaning that it'll use the Volume Shadow Copy service to take a snapshot of the saved state of my files, or the current condition of my files. I could also choose to only restore previous versions of files, and that would leave off these system settings and registry changes, or I could turn the whole thing off. I really like this top option. I mean, why not give yourself as much recoverability flexibility as you possibly can? It does require some hard drive space, but overall it's a small price to pay considering the benefit you get from this. Plus, very often we have an abundance of free hard drive space anyway these days. I'm going to let this remain the way it is right now. The operating system left it at this point. If you also want to delete any of the restore points, you can do that, but there's not really very often a reason for doing that, because as the restore point available usage space starts to fill up, then it will automatically scroll off the older ones, so it's kind of an automatic deletion of the oldest restore points that I have, and I'm not likely to want something probably from 2 months ago. If I have a problem after I've installed a driver, I probably want yesterday's restore point. So that's just an idea to keep in mind there as well. And then if I want to manually create a restore point, I can do that, and I'll just call this one Restore Point 2, and I'll click on Create. And then it takes a snapshot of my file data, my registry, and again, general system settings that we see here. And the restore point was created successfully. Now, let me minimize this and go to some actual files and show you an example of how this might be useful. For example, here I went to the Documents folder, and then I think our last nugget I talked about how much I love Oreos. So here I've written down a little lingering thoughts here on how much I love these Oreos. Well, I no longer have to share with my sisters. There's frosting in the middle, and now I can eat all I want. So I like all of these statements. Well, let's say that I was trying to select some text, and then oh, what am I doing here? Well, I better close this out because I don't want to mess all this whole thing up. Oh, wait a minute. I just saved those changes, didn't I? Oh, great Scott. Now look what I have. I no longer have two. What a statement about Oreos. That's not going to make any sense whatsoever. So I can go back to my previous version. Now, why does this appear? It appears because I made a restore point. So I choose previous version, and it shows one of the previous versions that I had made. If I want to open it just to view it, I can do that. Okay, so I can check that out. And then I can also then copy it. If I just want to make sure that I have like a dummy copy, I can copy that, for example, to the desktop and compare that version with this version. Okay, and if it's the one I really want, then I can just drag it in here and copy it. Okay, and move it and replace it. The other things you can do with this is to just restore it entirely, and that would restore it on top of this one without any other ceremony, without any dragging or dropping or anything like that. Now, it's slightly beyond our scope, but I gotta tell you, Volume Shadow Copy with servers is also an excellent thing that runs. This is something that you can schedule on a server to take snapshots whenever you want. You might want to schedule it to take snapshots of the user data 2 times a day, 3 times a day, however often you want, really. And it really only depends upon the amount of available hard drive space you have, because the more snapshots you take, the more drive space that you may need. Although it uses also a very conservative engine that will not continue to save space repetitively. In other words, if there's one file that really hasn't changed, it doesn't save that same file twice. Or if there was only a minor change in a really big file, it has a way of only saving mostly just the changes, plus a little bit of overhead. So it's very efficient, and we're really talking about servers here, but I just wanted to give you an example of how this might look. Here I'm on a UNC path to one of my servers. Here is the instructive material that I use for a lot of my CBT Nuggets topics. In this case, I've got the 70-680 exam objectives, and I always keep those in front of me because I want to make sure that I'm covering the exam objectives for you, and I don't forget anything. So what I want to do here is I could choose Restore Previous Versions. Now I don't have Word installed here, so we can't really double click on it to open it. But maybe I made a change to it, or I accidentally deleted some of the objectives and forgot about them. Oops. Well, what I can do is to go back to, here. Maybe they were better objectives at this point in time, and then I can, of course, then drag them out here and copy them to the desktop, or do any of those other restoration methods I talked about. Then I could double click on this and see if it's what I want, and then drag it in here, if I like, to restore that copy. And so that, again, is something that works on your servers, and it's a little bit different than a restore point, because it uses strictly something called the volume shadow copy service, and you have to configure this on the server. And you schedule it to take place on a regular basis, where on a standalone workstation, or on any workstation really, it will just create those snapshots at those previous times that I told you when restore points are made. Let's also address a few other recovery methods. One of those would be something called the last known good. We've had this since the days of early Windows NT. But basically what this is that when I successfully log on to a Windows installation, it keeps track of the state of the system at that time. And it says, hey, since this guy logged on, the operating system must be relatively healthy. And what it does is it takes my existing configuration under HQ Local Machine, and then actually it'd be System, and Current Control Set 1. See that right there? This represents my current logon, and it's assumed that this is going to be healthy since I did successfully log on. This has data about my various hardware, the drivers that I'm using, operating system, kind of a snapshot, if you will. And then it copies this known good configuration into this current control set down here. This actually is my last known good then, because this is copied up here down to this. And if I restart and choose last known good, it reloads this current control set into the operating system, and that is my last known good. It should get me back to a point where I can at least boot the operating system up and log on, and hopefully troubleshoot some other stuff if I need to. There's also the driver rollback, which we talked about in a previous nugget. Oh, and there's one I haven't put on here. I should squeeze this one in right here. Safe mode. Again, I think I've discussed that one as well in the past, but basically what this does is it loads only basic drivers. It's getting late, folks. Yeah, my kids talked me into taking them to see the latest Twilight movie, and my brains are all scrambled right now because I wanted to gouge my eyes out. Anyway, so we have the basic drivers that load there, as well as only basic operating system items as well. So any additional fancy drivers, fancy video card drivers, any kind of an updated serial ATA driver, any of that kind of stuff that I may have downloaded off the internet and updated, those don't get loaded. It's only the basic ones that are needed to get the operating system going. And it's sometimes useful so that you can at least get an interface going to troubleshoot the system. Whereas without safe mode, you may not even be able to get to a logon screen, or it may be in a reboot loop where it starts to start up and then it reboots. Okay, it's kind of like, again, the Twilight movies. They never seem to go away. Anyway, we also have the startup repair that we can work with. This is something that you can launch from WinRE. And you can also load this from any Windows startup DVD as well. But normally we do it from WinRE, and you can just choose Startup Repair as one of the repair options. This basically will check through the operating system to make sure that there's no boot files missing or that the boot configuration is not messed up. Now, you could manually fix the startup repair yourself, but that is quite an involved process. And there's some white paper and things from Microsoft on this, but basic idea there is you would use a tool called BCD edit.exe. And maybe some other tools as well, depending on how severe the problem is. Well, you could reconstruct everything using this tool, but it's very painstaking, whereas Startup Repair really knows what it needs to have Windows operate healthy, so it will then just run itself, and it'll just check through all of the health checks and fix it for you. It even identifies in a summary the various changes that it made. So it's a very good method for getting a system going again. In this nugget, we talked about backup and recovery, where we started off by talking about Windows backup that's included with the operating system. It's actually pretty good, and it allows you to create a system image. In fact, you can create multiple system images, which are going to be historical backups of your hard drives. Also, you can back up your data as well, and you can take a look here at some of the backup gotchas that I showed you. For example, if you back up to a network, you only get really one copy of the backup. There's also the system image restore that I showed you, and that's how to actually restore the image that you've created. It's not going to be much good to have the backup if you can't restore it. And then we took a look at system protection, which is going to be less less disruptive than replacing the entire hard drive image with a system image restore. You might be able to just go back to a previous point in time with the system configuration the way it was before you installed an update or a driver or something like this. And then we looked at some other recovery methods, such as using a last known good, which has similar function to system protection, except that there's only one good last known good restore. There's also driver rollback, which we've talked about before, and startup repair, which is a great way to get your operating system running again when it just won't seem to boot. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.